Great. Thank you. So I don't want to just talk about how the U.S. is bankrupt. I'm going to go global, and because right? And I want to say as a disclaimer. So I'm a political scientist. I'm not the only political scientist in the room, but I'm one of few. And I study sort of the politics of sovereign finance, and I mostly don't look at the U.S. And so that's kind of the place from which I'm coming. So we know there are lots of countries in the world that have high levels of debt to GDP. The U.S. is not alone in that respect. Countries here that are grayed out are not that they don't have high levels of debt. They just don't report in the series that the IMF has on this chart. So if we're kind of special because we're orange, but there's lots of dark blue as well. And so debt is kind of a global concern. And indeed, if you look at the overall stock of debt, global debt is kind of at a place where it hasn't been since the Second World War. Even before the pandemic, people were talking about lots of countries being at moderate or high risk of debt distress. Then you throw on the pandemic, you throw on the war in Ukraine, now you throw on the war in Iran, and things are not looking good from the point of view of sovereign debt. A lot of the work that I do is focused on the global south, and if you look at low-income countries, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank estimate that maybe 50 or so countries are at moderate or high risk of debt distress. And so maybe we should feel better about the U.S. because maybe it's not quite at that level. But of course, if you think about what's going on elsewhere in advanced economies, there was this acronym back during the Eurozone crisis of PIGS. This was not an acronym that Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, or Spain liked. But they can sort of take heart because now apparently the FT says we have BIFs. Which are Britain, Italy, and France. And so concerns, again, about the sustainability of debt in high-income countries as well, and kind of rising yields there. So I wanted to kind of give you some things you could think about if you have a long journey home or if you have insomnia, by saying a little bit about what we sort of political scientists do when we think about the politics of sovereign debt. There is an old argument, as many of you probably know, that democracies are better able to borrow relative to their non-democratic counterparts because their promises are more credible, because they are more transparent, because there are more constraints on the executive. So one of the things my colleagues and I have done is demonstrated that this is actually conditional, that the democratic advantage for countries that want to borrow money is conditional on sort of market liquidity. And when global markets are tight and risk-averse, it matters. When there's more liquidity, investors in the bond market don't seem to care whether your institutions are democratic or autocratic, accounting for all of your macro fundamentals and so on. So that's kind of one thing to think about. A second, more broadly, is that a lot of governments worldwide make choices about how they borrow. Not only about sort of borrowing in, let's say, foreign versus domestic currency or at short or long maturities, but also do we borrow from the bond market? Do we go to commercial banks? Do we go to resource-backed lenders? Do we go to China and Chinese financial institutions? Do we go to the World Bank? And a lot of those choices around borrowing instruments also reflect governments' concerns with their, what we like to call their political survival, that is to say, staying in office. So there's some work that a colleague and I have done that shows that to the extent that governments are more transparent in how they report kind of economic and financial information, they are more likely to borrow from the bond market as opposed to going to banks. They are more likely to go to multilateral financial institutions as opposed to going bilateral kind of government to government. That is to say, governments that like to be transparent also don't mind borrowing with instruments that are more transparent. Governments that want to be more opaque don't mind paying a premium to borrow through these more opaque sources of financing. And my caveat here as a political scientist is that there's been lots of talk kind of out there in the international community about the importance of encouraging transparency in debt and debt management. This would be a really good thing. It would help us prevent the buildup of unsustainable debt. It would help us prevent crises. And I think it's important to realize that transparency is partly a matter of capacity. Do governments have the kind of resources and the know-how to do this? But it is also very much, I think, a matter of will, right? Some governments don't want to be transparent for various reasons. Okay, so that's the kind of second thing to think about is how governments make these choices around financing instruments, how they reflect domestic politics, related to some other work that my colleagues and I have done looking at how government ideology helps to explain in the developing world whether governments borrow in their own domestic currencies or in foreign currencies, usually in dollars. Left-leaning governments seem to have a revealed preference for borrowing in their own currency, even if that means borrowing at shorter maturities and paying higher rates to do so. So this is all kind of thinking about domestic politics in countries matters for how countries think about debt. And we can think about the same thing in the context of the U.S. Two other things to mention then are that we also have some more recent research which suggests that voters look to international markets for signals about their government's competence or about sort of the viability of different political candidates. So I have a working paper co-authored with Hannah Loeffler, who's here, as well as Cameron Ballard-Rosa and Peter Rosendorf, where we look at how changes in sovereign credit ratings outcomes affect mass approval of the government. So even once you account for all the other things that might drive those changes, right? People surveyed on one side of a ratings downgrade are more positive about their government than those surveyed on the other side, just in a kind of within a short window. And so we might think that governments care about financial markets not only as kind of a source of funding, but also because their publics might look to those markets for information. And there's other work that we've done in the context of Brazil's election a few years ago, kind of looking at something similar. The last thing, my last little political science thing to say is that we also know that domestic political considerations matter when governments are thinking about, do we ask for a debt restructuring? Do we default on our debt? Do we impose austerity and keep servicing our debt? And so my colleague Cameron Ballard-Rosa had a book a few years ago looking at this again in developing countries and thinking about how governments are calculating around, if we have to impose austerity, on what groups will that fall? If we default, on who will that fall? And thinking about how the balance in countries among those factors then determines government's decisions around that, right? So that's a long-winded way of trying to convince all of you who already believe this that politics makes a difference. Now, when we do these analyses, a lot of my work has been, sort of frontier and emerging market economies. Sometimes it's kind of more broadly looking at wealthy economies as well. But the U.S. almost always gets excluded from the analyses that people do in a cross-national sense. The U.S. is an outlier. It screws things up, is the kind of short answer for this, right? It's different in many ways. And so, and we're so good in the U.S. in so many ways at sort of, American exceptionalism. And of course, there's an argument to be made that the U.S. has had this so-called exorbitant privilege, right? Which is to say that by virtue of the dollar's role as a global reserve currency, and the demand, therefore, for dollar-denominated assets, the U.S. has been able to borrow at much lower rates than it would otherwise, given its macroeconomic fundamentals. There's a debate among economists right now. You might have heard this paper from the New York Fed references the worst paper ever by Stephen Mirren. There's a debate about what the decline globally in central bank reserve holdings of dollars means. And so on one side of the debate, there are people like Barry Eichengreen sort of saying, bad news. On the other side, there are folks at the New York Fed, including Linda Goldberg, sort of saying, well, if you decompose this, it's actually only a few countries that have large reserve portfolios, like China and Switzerland, that have decreased their dollar holdings, but it's kind of driving that global numbers. So the headline here, right, is that the U.S. is still the dollar is still the most important reserve currency globally. Its role has declined in central bank portfolios a little bit. So that exceptionalism, maybe that's starting to go. It's also the case, of course, that people have long assumed that there's almost no default risk on U.S. Treasuries. We are also very lucky in the U.S. because we get to borrow entirely in our own currency. Right? That's not true in many countries. Even if you start to think about France or Germany, right, they're borrowing in a currency that they are part of in the euro, but it's not a currency where they get to control the money supply. So this means, of course, we have the opportunity to monetize the debt, to inflate it away, to kind of think about fiscal dominance. I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying it's a thing about the U.S. And then finally, most of our debt is held by domestic creditors. So that suggests there's a home country bias and a lack of diversification. But a lot of people will argue that domestic investors are more patient, more tolerant to kind of political risk, maybe more familiar with it than foreign investors. And so that might also kind of help to keep the U.S. exceptional, help to keep us out of trouble. All of that said, it's probably like we're kind of losing our exceptionalism, right, as we know. So every year, the International Monetary Fund, for all of its member states, does what's called an Article 4 consultation. And they go through and sort of look at the economy and sort of come up with a report. I mean, you can read it, and it also will solve your insomnia. And they look at sort of what the kind of economic expectations are for a country, and they try to give policy advice. Now, for countries that don't actually borrow money from the International Monetary Fund, this doesn't really matter in terms of it being linked to any sort of IMF behavior, but they still do it. The most recent U.S. Article 4 report was released a few weeks ago, and there's a part of it where they talk about the kind of exposure to sovereign debt stress, and all you need to know from this is that what they say is that over the medium term, the U.S. is, by all of their metrics, at high risk of some kind of sovereign stress. So what's going on here? Right? Well, one, of course, is we know that U.S. debt levels have gone up, right? We've seen this consistently over the last day and a half. We know debt servicing costs are going up. What the IMF doesn't talk much about is also that other countries are increasingly annoyed with the U.S. I mean, that's probably to put it mildly, right? And that the policies that we are pursuing might indeed kind of be creating a search for other kinds of assets, right? And so on the supply side, not clear what's going to replace the dollar. So maybe there's still this kind of there is no alternative. But on the demand side, I think that the U.S. government is kind of engaging in actions that are making people really want to find alternatives. And that relates to some entities trying to avoid the U.S. financial system in the wake of sanctions. But it also, I would argue, relates to some of the kind of institutional erosion, lack of transparency, lack of respect for rule of law that we've seen. And it also, of course, relates to concerns about and attacks on the Fed's political independence and about the kind of possibility of fiscal dominance. So this is actually kind of part of what's concerning. And so if you dig deeper into the IMF's Article 4 consultation, which you can find up online, they talk a lot about these kind of growing burdens. Part of what's in there as well is that the U.S. has a relatively low average time to maturity of its profile of outstanding debt. It's around 6 years. And, you know, for a lot of countries, there's been this effort to kind of lengthen that maturity profile, even if it's more expensive, because it means that you less frequently have to roll over your debt. And if something nasty happens in the markets, right, if suddenly Liz Truss is around, that's going to kind of hit you less hard. The UK actually has a 14-year average time to maturity of its debt, right? So we are really kind of on the low end here. And so that might also, in addition to our debt burden, kind of expose the U.S. to some market pressures. Okay, so and I promised I was going to only use 10 minutes. Turns out I want my whole 15. So last thing then is that this gets us back into the domestic politics of fiscal adjustment, right? And I think what we want to think about maybe from a policy point of view is under what conditions will U.S. elected officials come to believe that debt and its consequences is a threat to their kind of survival in office, that is to say, to their ability to win re-election? In most parts of the world, what we see is that political actors really want to delay adjustment. Right? They want to kind of hang on, gamble for resurrection, hope it's somehow going to work its way out. Maybe there's going to be this giant, revenue windfall that comes on, that sort of thing, right? So there's incentives to delay is super, super common. And the question is, under what conditions are voters kind of willing to support fiscal adjustment, right? Especially because we know that tax increases as well as spending cuts are really are very unpopular. And so where I want to end is to say that I have a co-author, Cameron Ballard-Rose, as well as Lucy Martin, former colleagues at UNC, did a survey recently where they asked people how they feel about debt. And what I think is really useful here is that they say not how do you feel about debt, because you say that most people say, well, it's bad, and people kind of think that the household analogy holds for governments and all that. But they say, given a potential fiscal sort of hit, what should we do? That is to say, would you support the U.S. Engaging in more borrowing? Should the U.S. cover this with a spending cut? Should the U.S. cover this with tax increases? Right? And this is done in a kind of conjoint experiment thing where people are given lots of sort of potential combinations of things. You can kind of extract their underlying preferences. In the slides, there's a kind of picture of some of their results. One of the really interesting takeaways is a lot of Americans don't mind the U.S. borrowing more if they're told that we will be borrowing from domestic investors or from European investors. If you say it's going to be from Chinese investors, they say, never mind, we don't want to fund it with debt. Similarly, if you tell people that borrowing more is a way of avoiding cuts in benefits, especially things like Social Security as well as military spending, then they're all in for the debt. And there are similar results on taxation as well. And I'm out of time,